The husband just threw, I believe, the wife into the pool.
This male next door threw his wife in the pool, and now he's holding her down on water.
She's floating in the water.
2 years after he stabbed his wife to death, Scott Falater went to trial here in Phoenix. His sole defense was sleepwalking.
He says he has no memory of the brutal attack.
When he stabbed his wife to death.
They have a genetic defect in the brain between deep sleep and arising into dreaming sleep.
Scott Falater said he was sleepwalking.
Sleepwalking
the entire time.
That defect means they can get up and not be awake and behave strangely.
Never, ever wake up a sleepwalker.
I'm waking him up!
No! Oh, don't wake them up!
Oh, that's a myth!
What most people knew about sleepwalking came from, like, situation comedies.
Ralph, my Ed's gone. He's walking in his sleep again.
Someone just walking around with their hands out and their eyes closed.
Steve?
If you really knew what the research is showing and what can happen, you wouldn't be joking about it.
They're enormously strong, that it's not just one stab wound, it's 44 stab wounds. Another thing that's common is they don't recognize the person they've attacked. There's no face recognition.
The closest analogy I've been able to come up with to it in my mind is that it's like an accidental killing.
This was no accident. 44 stab wounds, putting her head underwater in a pool.
I tell you, I did not do that intentionally. I did not plan to do anything like that. I did not wake up and do something like that. If I had waken up, I would have been totally horrified.
It was a brutal eruption of vicious violence from a man who was known as mild-mannered, which was a perception that added credibility to the notion, well, maybe he was asleep.
Nearly a year after killing his wife, Scott Falater is escorted from his jail cell to a nearby hospital to undergo a sleep study.
He was in shackles, so I could hear him coming down the hallway. He was accompanied by 2 guards that stayed with me the entire night.
Over 4 nights, he's wired up to electrodes and monitors that measure the depth and quality of his sleep.
In the end, though, the results were ambiguous. The defense says they do show that Scott Falater has a propensity for sleepwalking, but the state says they do not.
Let the record reflect presence of counsel, the defendant, all members of the jury, and Mr. Kimmer. I'll call you next witness.
The defense brings in 2 heavyweight sleep experts.
I direct the Sleep Disorders Center.
A PhD doctor, yes, and director of their sleep disorders service.
Dr. Roger Broughton and Dr. Rosalind Cartwright. They are leaders in the field of sleepwalking violence. Their names are on scientific studies and in textbooks.
I wouldn't say that I was a little concerned. I would say that I was a lot concerned. They hired 2 of the, what I consider to be prominent experts in the field. And so I knew that there was some viability to that defense, and it's something that I knew that I had to combat.
The 2 had just finished working on a sleepwalking defense case in Canada, where that defendant was acquitted.
During the trial, 5 psychiatrists testified that Parks could have been sleepwalking when he drove from Pickering to Scarborough and killed his mother-in-law and wounded his father-in-law.
And after a trial where Dr. Broughton was a key witness saying, yeah, I believe he was sleepwalking, the man was acquitted.
The Park case provides something that you can tell a jury to look at and say, see, it is possible.
You have conducted an evaluation of Scott Falater in this case, have you not?
Yes, I have.
And have you reached an opinion regarding whether he was sleepwalking at the time he killed his wife?
It's my strong belief that that was the case.
You have an opinion whether Scott Falater was in a sleepwalking state when he stabbed his wife?
In my opinion, he was.
Scott's case is really about as pure a case as you can find. A pure case of a sleepwalking violence case. at its purest form.
He was walking around like with a bomb in him that could go off, and he just didn't know it was there.
And I understand people's reluctance to accept something as far-fetched as sleepwalking, but there is no other explanation.
Scott Falater says he remembers none of this, but he and his sleepwalking experts speculate as to how this killing might have happened.
Sleep-deprived and stressed out from problems at work, Scott crashes into bed and then rising in a sleepwalking state.
He gets the idea, now I'm going to try to fix the pool pump again.
It's not unusual for sleepwalkers to want to finish something they've done or something they habitually do.
I suspect that his wife missed him and got up to find him and bring him back.
Yarmila comes and interrupts him in his sleepwalking state, which the experts will tell you is a dangerous thing to do.
They do attack, and attack abruptly and with viciousness and extraordinary strength.
She went out there and disturbed him some way, and it may have just been nothing more than putting her hand on his shoulder.
You know, honey, come back to bed.
He sees her not as his wife, but as some threat that his instinctual brain responds to while he's asleep, and he decides to dispatch the threat.
And that is when Scott Falater attacks.
You were involved in the search of the garage and the cars.
Officers who searched the Falater home tell the jury how they spotted a clue that could easily have been overlooked.
Every box, every bag, and the vehicles where we actually found the evidence that connected Scott to the murder.
It's an incredible defense. A Phoenix man says he was sleepwalking when he stabbed his wife 44 times and then drowned her in their pool.
Today, the sleepwalker murder trial erupts with dramatic testimony.
The Maricopa County prosecutor is about to call his own witnesses to try to prove that Scott Falater was not sleeping when he killed his wife.
But first, some curious evidence. Officers who searched the Falater home tell the jury how they spotted a clue that could easily have been overlooked.
Your name, sir?
Robert James Berdinsky.
And who do you work for?
City Phoenix Police Department.
And what unit are you in?
Homicide.
While Scott Falater is being interviewed down at police headquarters, detectives are finishing up their case back at the house.
They went and got a search warrant, started searching the garage. You were involved in the search of the garage and the cars.
Every box, every bag, and the vehicles were where we actually found the evidence that connected Scott to the murder.
Remember, a neighbor testified he saw Scott Falater holding his wife's head underwater in the pool, but no one saw what came before that, the stabbing.
So a critical juncture in the trial comes when the evidence is presented about what Scott Falater was doing when he supposedly sleepwalks his way toward killing his wife.
When detectives go in to search Scott Falater's Volvo,
They see a piece of a T-shirt sticking out of a compartment in the trunk of the Volvo station wagon.
Once you opened that up, did you find anything?
Yes, I did.
Inside that compartment, they find the mother lode of evidence.
What did you find?
A black plastic trash bag.
And anything in and around this black plastic trash bag?
It was not Exhibit A, it was Exhibit 15, the most innocent thing you can possibly imagine, a Tupperware container.
A Tupperware container that had articles of clothing within them that looked odd, and then on a closer examination I noticed that they had blood staining on them also.
And that's where they found the clothes that he had been wearing, apparently, when he stabbed her.
So what did you find inside of this Tupperware container once you opened it?
A honey-type knife, which was blood-stained.
Do you recognize it? What is it?
It's the honey knife that was found inside the Tupperware container.
That was the murder weapon. Voila. There we are. Everything we're looking for. We just hit the jackpot.
One of the strong points of the prosecution was sleepwalkers have no need to hide anything because they don't know that what they're doing is any way out of the ordinary. They're just zombies, essentially, walking the earth.
All of these cases are full of contradictions. They kill somebody they love. They're very hard to understand. The contradictions about his tidiness and untidiness, they were both there. I mean, he left the body. It was obviously floating in the pool, and then he tidies up the clothes. And that makes absolutely no sense. You can't approach it with a sense of logic, and neither can he, poor soul.
Now, prosecutor Juan Martinez begins to cross-examine the defense sleepwalking experts.
Those are your notes, right?
Juan Martinez was looking for anything where he could get the expert to cast doubt on his own thoughts. And Juan Martinez was able to effectively do that.
The evidence suggests that Scott Falater had a pretty busy evening that night, especially for someone who was supposedly asleep.
In and out of the house, up and down the stairs, changing clothes before the stabbing and then again after.
And so now you know that he's changed clothing at least twice and maybe 3 times. Does that give you even a little bit more pause?
Just the change of clothes gave me pause.
It gave him pause that Scott Falater changed clothes.
And putting the clothes back in the trunk, which I thought was an unusual feature for sleepwalking.
It gave him pause, the intricate way that the clothes were hidden. So getting an expert to raise doubts about his own thoughts was very effective for Juan Martinez.
Then the prosecutor calls his own sleepwalking expert to the stand, Dr. Mark Pressman.
A sleep expert with the sort of street edginess about him. He was completely dismissive of the idea that all of this could have happened while Scott Falater was asleep.
First of all, what is your opinion as to whether or not, back on January 16th of 1997, when he stabbed his wife, whether or not the defendant was sleepwalking?
I think all the evidence says he was awake, and all the evidence says that his behaviors were far too complicated to be sleepwalking.
Well, so many complex acts happen between the beginning and the end. We have almost 45 minutes here. And I've actually broken it down. I have a list of 64 separate behaviors from the beginning to the end.
Far too complex, he testified, for someone to do all of those things in his sleep.
In your experience, do sleepwalkers tend to conceal objects? Is that something that they do, generally speaking?
Sleepwalkers may misplace items, but to my knowledge, sleepwalkers never hide something. And these items were not only hidden, they were packaged neatly and put in a location where it was impossible for someone else to see them.
For the prosecution's sleepwalking expert, the most compelling evidence that Scott Falater was awake came after he stabbed his wife.
He returned to Yarmila's body and dragged her over to the pool, held her under. A second act of violence.
The only way that sleep specialists think that violence can happen with a sleepwalker is that somebody confronts them, physically confronts them, gets in their way. That's clearly impossible on the second episode of violence. The victim was laying there, near death. Clearly, she didn't get up and get in his way.
When sleepwalkers become violent, they don't go out seeking someone to be violent with.
The prosecution had people who are not the best sleepwalking experts. They spoke with excessive certitude, in my opinion, which you would find in someone who really doesn't quite know what he's talking about.
In this case, Juan Martinez has everything a prosecutor could ask for.
He's got the weapon. He's got an eyewitness. There's just one thing he hasn't got.
And it's something he really wants, a motive.
And suddenly, it seems to appear, a phrase Scott Falater used, unforgivable sin.
Whatever this unforgivable sin is, he can't wait to be rid of her.
All right, please. Day 4 of the sleepwalking murder trial takes some interesting twists and turns.
Watch enough trials and you'll see a jailhouse snitch testify. They clink into the courtroom in handcuffs and leg irons, and they testify for the prosecution, but not in this case. 2 of Scott Falater's cellmates testified for the defense.
While he was in jail, cellmates said that they heard unusual activity and saw him appearing to walk in his sleep.
He was like in a daze. And then he walked straight for the cell door. He looked out the door, and I remember saying, "What's the matter? What's going on?"
All of a sudden, I heard this noise. There was movement, and Scott got up, went over to the door, and shook the heck out of the door, just like, just shaking, And I said, "Scott, is there something wrong?" He never answered me.
Were they making it up? I always had kind of doubts about their testimony a little bit. We still went ahead and used them anyway.
All right, you're excused. Thanks. Oh, you actually?
Yes, we would call Michael Falater.
solemnly swear? I think the other witnesses that were very powerful were the kids. When Megan and Michael took the stand defending their father.
Would you please tell us your name?
Michael David Falater.
And is your dad Scott Falater?
Yeah.
I don't know how I did it. I know I had to be strong. I know I had to tell the truth and answer the questions. And I believe that's what I did.
And you're aware that your dad has been charged with the first degree murder of your mother?
Yeah.
It has to enter the jury's mind. What do the kids think? Do the kids buy this? Do the kids believe their father was a sleepwalker? Do the kids believe their father was capable of cold-blooded murder?
Did your mom and your dad love each other?
Yes.
Did you ever see your dad have much of a temper over the years?
No.
You ever seen him blow up and get mad?
Well, I've seen him angry before, but I've never actually seen him go into a rage or, do anything.
They were very clear that they had loved their mother, but they loved their father. And, they didn't blame him and they were supportive.
Our next witness will be the defendant, Scott Falater.
The biggest witness was Scott Falater himself.
Defendants rarely take the witness stand. Why don't they take the witness stand? It's usually a really bad idea.
A difficult time accepting the fact that you were the one that stabbed him.
Yeah, I mean, it took me a very long time, probably several weeks, before I could really even admit it openly to myself that I had actually done that.
Why did he take the witness stand? He had to. The cases where you take the stand are cases where you have no criminal record, and you have to convince the jury of your state of mind. And the only thing on trial was his state of mind.
Scott, did you knowingly kill your wife?
No, not at all. I couldn't knowingly kill her. No one deserved it less of anyone that I know than her.
Do you have any memory at all of stabbing?
No, I do not remember doing that.
The hard questions come during cross-examination. Prosecutor Juan Martinez tries to show that the later marriage wasn't so happy.
He reminds Scott Falater that a coworker testified Falater had called his wife dumpy.
Scott made a comment, dumpy girls, make really good wives and mothers,
Did he use the word dumpy or overweight?
Well, I'm not sure it was the word dumpy or overweight, but, he was trying to say that, you didn't have to have a perfect woman or a perfect girl to be a good mother or a good wife.
Take a look at that woman. Does that woman appear to you to be dumpy?
She is not dumpy, sir. The word dumpy was never my word. In fact, he did several times where he took witnesses' words and put them in my mouth.
The prosecutor, Juan Martinez, who had been grasping for a motive throughout this trial, seized on a remark made in the notes of a psychologist who'd interviewed Scott Falater in jail.
See that up there?
Yes, I do.
A phrase Scott used during their conversation.
It does say unforgivable sin, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Juan made the biggest thing out of this, that somehow Yarmila had committed some kind of a horrible something suggesting unfaithfulness by Yarmila. And he kept trying to grind on that to make that a motive.
When you say unforgivable sin, it suggests that she had cheated on Scott Falater. But that's really not the case, is it?
I'm not suggesting that anybody committed the sin of adultery. I can't get into Mr. Falater's head and look to see what he considered to be an unforgivable sin. It is his phrase.
So when you uttered the word unforgivable sin, what did you mean?
I felt that perhaps I had committed the unforgivable sin by killing Yarmila. And that obviously was bothering me a lot.
When a defendant takes the stand, the whole case starts to hinge on the defendant's testimony. Does the jury like the defendant or not? Does the jury believe the defendant or not? And if they don't, then you've lost your case.
All right, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I told you yesterday, now's the time for the lawyers to give their closing arguments in the case.
All of the bizarre and baffling and surprising evidence came down to this. Did Scott Falater innocently kill his wife in his sleep, or did he fake it to cover up her murder?
This was the person in his life. This was his soulmate. This was his friend. This was his companion. She meant everything to him. This was his emotional support. You don't go out and you have someone like that. You kill him.
This guy here killed his wife, and he's guilty of first-degree murder.
It is a courtroom drama. Is a jury going to be able to be convinced that such a heinous, violent act was done by someone who was asleep for it the entire time? Is Scott Falater going to be able to pull this off?
Okay, this is Mike Riley. I would need hands. Who wants to ask questions? Jerry.
Summarize for us your deliberations and tell us how you reached your verdict.
During the 6-week trial, the jury heard testimony from 52 witnesses. 180 court exhibits were marked and put into evidence. But it took only 8 hours of deliberations before the jurors sent word to the judge they had a verdict.
I had a press buddy who was a local reporter, and he called and said, the jury has a verdict.
Let the record reflect presence of all counsel, the defendant, and all members of the jury.
Boy, the courtroom was packed when the jury came back.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've been informed that you have a verdict, and is that true?
We're rolling tape.
Quiet, please.
Jurors are under no obligation to explain themselves, but in the strange case of Scott Falater, some were persuaded to sit down with 2020 correspondent Connie Chung to reveal what went on in the jury room.
When you were first seated as jurors, how did you view this case?
Well, I have to admit, my first impression was sleepwalking. Yeah, right. But then I realized that I really didn't know anything about sleepwalking.
Wanted to believe that it couldn't be premeditated murder. The guy could not actually go out and kill his wife like that.
They took an immediate vote after they went back to deliberate. And the first vote was 8-4. 4 people were not in favor of convicting.
The major issue was he or was he not sleepwalking, which was the decision we were making. If he was not sleepwalking, he was then guilty. If he was sleepwalking, he was not guilty.
I really didn't have a good explanation at all for anything like this to have happened.
When Scott Falater took the stand and swore that he did not remember what happened that night, how many of you believed him?
A number of them said that after Scott Falater had testified, that they were swayed to his side.
And all I could come up with was, maybe there's a tumor in my head or something really bad happened in my head.
Some of the jurors afterwards said, he came across as really sympathetic to me.
I saw Scott Falater as a very credible witness telling an incredible story. I thought he believed the answers that he was giving.
Did you have any thought in your mind or intent in your mind to kill Yarmila?
No way. No way. That's the furthest thing from my mind.
He came across as honest, and actually when he testified, I was swayed back. How could this man do this to his wife?
You were believing him?
Mm-hmm. I was believing him.
The why of this case has been the key question since the night of the murder. It's the question the homicide detective kept asking Scott in that interview room. Why?
What did she do that set you off like that? Nothing.
My initial thought on the Scott Falater case was someone would come forward and say, well, there was this affair at the office. Turns out there's an insurance policy, and then nobody came forward to say that there was any other explanation, there was any other motive.
No, the prosecutor doesn't have to prove motive, but if the prosecutor can establish motive, it sure goes a long way to meeting the standard of criminal intent.
The prosecution never established anything that even faintly resembled a motive. That is, in essence, what made our decision so difficult.
And they then hashed things out, and then it came down to 10-2, and there were 2 holdouts that were not in favor.
For the first time, jurors had a chance to examine the evidence police found at the crime scene. The bloody clothes and gloves, the Tupperware container, and the hunting knife used to kill Yarmila Falater.
This is a hunting knife. It's used for skinning and gutting animals and bleeding them. It's not used for any other purpose except for killing.
Some of them were saying, yeah, we can believe that he was sleepwalking when the initial attack with a knife happened.
It was the second act of violence that really swayed most people.
Some of the jurors were saying, okay, maybe I'll buy that you were asleep while stabbing your wife, but I'm not buying the idea that you would then come out again, see the body, and then drown the woman.
Thursday night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up the whole night. You got this man's life in your hands. He could get the death penalty.
The jury comes back on Friday morning. They send that message to a judge that they've announced a verdict.
Okay, Mr. Riley, if you could please hand off the verdict forms to Heather.
And it's handed over. The judge looks at it, and then the verdict is read.
We, the jury, duly impaneled and sworn in the above entitled action, upon our oaths do find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree.
It was a traumatic moment for all of us.
The jurors didn't just reject your sleepwalking defense. They believed that you planned this murder, that it was premeditated.
I would say, thank you for your hard work, but frankly, guys, you got it wrong. I am not a monster. I am not a murderer.
I would say these jurors needed a higher level of sophistication. I think because you're having to understand science, you had to understand that the whole field of sleep disorders is an evolving field.
The average person probably is not qualified to come up with the correct decision, certainly in the face of so much gobbledygook thrown in by the prosecutor. It takes a very intelligent person to see through all of that.
They're grasping.
Personally, I find that extremely insulting.
Yes.
That's very insulting.
I guarantee you that my lack of education had nothing to do with the guilty verdict. What convicted Scott Falater was the preponderance of evidence, and that was it.
I was extremely worried, about the death penalty.
Are you afraid to be put to death?
CR 97-00928, State of Arizona versus Scott Falater. It's the time set for 13-703 hearing. Is the state ready?
Yes, one more.
Judge Reinstein had to decide whether or not the death penalty was going to be imposed for Scott Falater.
On behalf of Mr. Falater, you're ready to proceed at this time. Attorneys that represent people in death penalty cases and have a sentencing where they're facing death, I think there's an anguish and a horror that we all feel, just fear.
In a capital punishment case like Scott Falater's, you go through a second sort of mini trial when you're deciding whether or not you're going to impose the death penalty or a life sentence. Both sides present testimony, including friends, family, and people who knew Scott from church, asking the judge to spare his life.
He was thoughtful and caring about other people.
I definitely see him as a teacher and a role model for people around him.
I don't believe the death penalty is appropriate for this man.
The state needs to show there was an aggravating factor, one of them just being how brutal the crime was.
Yes, he does deserve the death penalty, and it is because of what he did that night.
And the children also pleaded for their father's life. They had already lost their mom. They didn't want to lose their dad.
I'd like to tell the judge that I love him more than anything else in the world. And I'd like to be with him again sometime.
Michael said, I love him more than anything else in the world. And he had some tears coming silently down his cheek. And so did more than a few people watching the trial.
And then Scott Falater himself, before the judge who will decide his fate, defending his own life.
I accept the responsibility that it was I that killed her. I'm certainly sorry for the pain that Yarm must have felt that night.
With the victim's relatives pleading for lenience from the judge, it did seem to weigh on him.
It is ordered the defendant be sentenced to serve the remainder of his natural life in the Department of Corrections. Dated this 10th day of January.
His sentence was life without parole. He did not give the death penalty.
In the end, he was sentenced to life in prison.
Now, more than 2 decades later, you may wonder what's become of the man who claimed he killed in his sleep.
I'm recording all the cameras. They don't want us to record the cameras.
And we're just waiting for them
Yes, to let us in.
to let us in. Got it. This is Scott Falater today, serving that life sentence in an Arizona prison. I was able to briefly speak with him via video conference. It's a rare opportunity because typically Arizona does not allow TV interviews with inmates.
We're in the middle of a pandemic, and I understand you were personally impacted by COVID-19.
Back in June, I got very sick, and I'm still getting my sense of smell and taste back even after all this time.
Scott, your children, Michael and Megan, they both supported you during your trial. What is your relationship like with them today?
My daughter has not talked to me in some time. She said, coming to visit you, I feel so bad afterwards. And I told her, you know what, move on. Do what you have to do to live a good life. I couldn't be prouder of both of them. Whether they want to talk to me or not, I still, will go to my graves extremely proud of both of them.
I can hear the emotion in your voice. Do you?
Yeah. I miss them terribly. I love them terribly. You know, I'm so sorry for what I did to them.
Scott, have you forgiven yourself?
No, I doubt I ever will.
Do you believe your wife has forgiven you?
I think about what she had to go through that night and the pain and the terror she had to feel. I can't even fathom. But I believe that she would be willing to be more understanding and forgiving of me than I feel right now about myself. Yes.
Forgiven or not, Scott, who was very active in his church before all of this, says he was eventually excommunicated as a result of his conviction.
How hopeful are you that you may, despite that sentence, one day be released?
I don't plan on it. I don't expect it. Well, I really have no plans of going anywhere but here.
Have your thoughts changed at all about what you believe happened that night?
I cannot swear on a stack of Bibles that I was sleepwalking. All I can say is I do not know what happened. I understand the trauma and the suffering that this whole thing caused, and It's on me. There's no one else I can place the responsibility for. You know, it's on my shoulders, and I accept that. And I have to move on.
Scott Falater's son, Michael, was a teenager when his father went to prison. He's all grown up now with a family and a wife of his own. What does he have to say to his father?
Hey, Mike.
There's our driver. Start her up, Mike.
Go, run.
I just wondered how the kids were doing, hoping for the best for them,
The first time you spoke to your father after your mother died, do you remember what he said to you?
He said that he was proud of us and that he loved us.
My father was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, which my understanding is that he will die in prison.
When we started revisiting the Scott Falater case, we first contacted the Falater children. Megan Falater chose not to take part in this program. Michael is now an attorney in Las Vegas, and he has a family of his own.
In the 20-plus years since I've lost my mom, I think about her every day. I think about what she could be doing with my kids now, what life could have been like, and things that I've missed out on.
After all these years, I really want to say to those kids, good job for everything you've accomplished in life. Way to go.
Hi, sweetheart.
Hey, Dad.
How are you?
Pretty good.
2020 was there back in 1999 when the Falater kids visited their father in jail. And now, 2 decades later, 2020 is there again. This time, it's Michael visiting with his father in prison.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, how are you, Dad? He's still my dad, and I hope to always have that relationship with him, whether he's in prison or he's out.
You know what I miss was when we would go out on Christmas Eve and buy stuff for Mom. Remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I miss that stuff. Being out, just being with you guys.
Yeah. He teaches parenting classes. He's worked with a local community college to bring in vocational training for other inmates so that they can learn job skills.
One footnote about the man who fought so hard to send Scott Falater to prison, former Maricopa County prosecutor Juan Martinez.
He went on to win convictions in other high-profile murder cases, including Jodi Arias.
She's the one that did the stabbing, and she's the one that shot him.
But then came allegations of ethics violations and sexual harassment of female law clerks in his office.
Martinez continues to deny those allegations, but in 2020, he consented to being disbarred, voluntarily giving up his license to practice law.
All right, I see it says we have 5 minutes left here.
I saw that too.
I love you too, Dad. I love you.
I love you, Mike.
Okay.
Okay, you take care.
You too.
20 years later, when I think of Scott Falater, it is still a complete and total mystery to me as to what the hell happened that night.
Maybe that's the appeal of why this case is still being talked about, is all these years later, I can't give you a definitive answer as to what I think happened in that backyard. I can't tell you for sure whether the man was asleep or not.
I think we all have a sense that we are capable of performing as human beings acts of great dignity and occasionally acts of great violence. And Scott Falater was a figure capable of both.
Now, Scott Falater's last chance for freedom would be clemency from the governor.
And Amy, as you know, his attorney, though, says that's doubtful given Scott's reluctance to admit that he consciously killed his wife.
So what do you think? A horrible tragedy while sleepwalking or murder, as the jury found? Let us know.